You are listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to C-Suite Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this series, and in today's discussion, we're going to talk about the Global South, its meaning, its importance, and how it affects the global economy. Joining me today is Dr. Lori Esposito Murray, the former president and CEO of the Committee for Economic Development. Lori, welcome back.
Thanks, Steve. Really pleased to be here, especially on such an important topic.
Yeah, and you can't turn on the television or watch the news today without hearing this concept of the global South. Can you just help us understand what is the global South? What is included from a geographic standpoint, but then more importantly, beyond that from a geopolitical perspective?
Okay, Steve. So I think most importantly, and it sounds counterintuitive, but the most important point is that it's not geographic. So this is not the equator doing a dividing line between North and South. Some of the most important and significant countries included in the global South are China and India, both in the North. So it's important to keep that in mind. It's not geographic. It is mostly economic and political, geopolitical. So on the economic front, it's the new terminology, it's not actually new terminology, let's say it's the popular terminology again now, to identify and define the common interests of what we had called the developing countries, the third world countries, the non-aligned countries, and that is the global South. So there's an economic definition, but there's also an important political definition. It is not the North. It's not the industrialized countries. It's not the Western powers. It's actually the group of nations trying to find their identity and promote their issues that are separate and different from the advanced industrialized economies.
So, what countries exactly are included?
So it's interesting in terms of, as we're saying, you're going north and south, but basically it's Asia, including China, Africa, the Caribbean, the Pacific Islands, and the Pacific Asian countries, excluding Japan, New Zealand, and Australia, which are considered part of the advanced industrialized Western countries.
Yeah, and it also includes Mexico, I think, and most of
Right,
South America.
Latin America and South America, yes.
Yeah. So no NATO nations are involved, or in this classification, right?
Right, exactly.
And no developed nations. Okay. So then there is you mentioned it, but there's the inverse term that's used, and that's the global North. And so that would include what countries?
So there you're basically looking at the major industrialized Western aligned countries, US, Canada, Europe, Israel, Australia, New Zealand, and in Asia you have South Korea and Japan. That is seen as basically as the global North. There's an interesting identification regarding Russia. Russia is in the North, but Russia is very closely aligned with China, and particularly in terms of the goals of the global South, which is to actually challenge the economic power of the U.S. and its allies. So Russia is an interesting element in this discussion.
Yeah, it's really interesting, particularly as you think about how Russia has been aligned and not aligned over the course of history with some of these same countries. Yeah.
Yeah, and during the Cold War, Russia, the Soviet Union was one of the countries that the non-aligned group was not aligning themselves with. They were not aligning themselves with the U.S. or with the Soviet Union, and now Russia's playing a different role. Russia's closely aligned with China, and one of its major objectives is to diminish the power, both economic and political, of the U.S. and the West.
Yeah. Now you mentioned that the term the global South is not a new term. So how did this term come about? Because in its original use was meant, I think, a little more narrowly than it's being applied today. Can you just help us understand how that's evolved?
So most analysts really identify Carl Oglesby, an American political activist at the time in 1969, who coined this term, the Global South. And he did that in an article, and he was talking about a set of countries dominated by the global North. And that's one of the underlying principles of the non-aligned movement and the group of 77 at the UN, which are official groups at the UN who existed well, the non-aligned movement existed well before this identification of the global south with these goals of breaking off the dominance, the economic dominance of the global north. And so that's the origins of the phrase. As I said, over the years, the international community has used different terms, and each of them have been criticized for being pejorative for the developing nations, the global South nations, the non aligned nations, as developing, lower income, middle income, all of these terms, third world. And I think Madeleine Albright even used the so called third world to try and be less pejorative about the third world. So we've been struggling as an international community on how to identify these developing nations that have similar political and geopolitical agendas in terms of what their concerns are, and they're concerned about the dominance of the global north, both economically and as far as its priorities go. And so the global south has again now come back into vogue reluctantly. A lot of the international organizations are reluctantly using it, but nonetheless, it's now come back into vogue as a description for these developing countries.
Yeah, I think, if you think it depends on which lens you're using, I guess is what you're saying. Because if you think about it strictly in economic terms, most economists look at GDP per capita. And then there's also purchase power parity, which means, which gets to standard of living. But it's a matter of of countries that are very well developed, wealthier on a per capita basis versus those that aren't. And power in the world from a geopolitical standpoint tends to carry to those, to those wealthier nations. And I think this is so you've got economic terms, you've got geopolitical terms, security, so you've got a lot of factors in here that come into play, right?
Yeah, and I think, given the fact that both China and India are part of the global South, 3.4 billion people between the two of them. GDP, China has a GDP of 18 trillion, India has 3.4 trillion. It's hard to actually put it in economic terms, and especially when looking at China, the second largest economy in the world, just right behind the US. So I think the political sense of being aggrieved by an economic and international political order that has predominantly been led by the North and the Western alliance concerns and the industrial nations concerns is really the binding piece of continuity that brings these countries together.
Okay, so there's this other concept called the Brant line, and that's also used by by experts today. Can you talk to us about what the Brant line is, and then how it compares and contrasts to this global North and global South concept?
Well, it's interesting because the Brant line, and just to give a little bit of history, the Brant line comes from a commission set up in 1977 by Robert McNamara, who was then head of the World Bank. And it was led by the former West German Chancellor Willy Brandt to look at how the nations of the South, how we could deal with the poverty, the development of these southern nations that were low and middle income, and how we could equalize or help their development. And so Willy Brandt led this commission, and part of the commission drew this line. It was really based on GDP at the time. And the line almost exactly follows the geographical lines that define the global South. You have Mexico and South America, going over to the Africa, the Middle East, China, and then skipping Japan, New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, but including the rest of Asia.
Yeah. So anyway, there over time there's been all of these concepts, and it's been, I think some of them started way back in the League of Nations and then the United Nations and so forth. But here we are today, and you have these concepts. So can you talk about some of the major friction points between the global South and the so-called global North? Now I sound like Madeleine Albright.
So, basically, the major areas of friction now, as I said previously, what led to, and these are institutionalized organizations in the UN, Group of 77 and the non-aligned movement. What led to their formulation was basically an aggrieved sense that the post-colonial development was being suppressed by the agenda of the advanced economies. And today, the way that is manifesting itself is with a particular focus on the international political structure, the international organizations not representing many of these countries in the global South. And remember, the global South accounts for about 40% of the world's GDP and 88% of its population. And that's how they're really coordinating to push their agenda because of their interests. So you're looking at how the international organizations are structured. You're looking at major issues like climate and how climate, which is really being affected by the industrialized nations, the challenges to climate. But the South sees itself as suffering. The global South sees itself as suffering from the industrialization that has taken place in the global North. And so it's climate, it's the international organization, it's debt. They carry a significant debt burden. They're very concerned about trade and tariffs, and really believe that they should be receiving preferential treatment in terms of enhancing their development and allowing their development to happen. So those are some of the really key issues now that are actually bringing the global South together and as part of their important agenda. And needless to say, underlying that is the dominance in the economy of the U.S. and the Western and its Western allies in terms of their dominance and the dominance of the dollar and having more of an influence and play in that.
Well, those two numbers that you threw out are worth repeating because they're stunning. It's 88% of the population, and so I mean, just consider that. So you've got 88% of the population with just a very small portion. So GDP per capita in those countries is very small. So from their perspective, it's got to look like you got 12% of the population in this concentrated in the West who are trying to tell the rest of us what to do, and that sets up some element or can set up some element of resentment, right?
Exactly. And, I do want to make the point that part of the acceleration of the importance of the global South and also what we're seeing in terms of the challenges and who's leading the global South, whether it's India and Modi or whether it's China and Xi, whether it's Brazil and Lula, they're all South Africa, they're all trying to compete with each other as leaders of this global South movement. I just want to make the point that it's been accelerated. The importance of the global South and their agenda has been accelerated by both COVID and Ukraine. And the reason why I'm saying that is that the pandemic just exaggerated the issue of with vaccines on how the global North was handling the problem and the lack of concern for the global South. And this is from the perceptions of the global South. So the COVID-19, the pandemic, really brought to the forefront of these nations that they were secondary on the priority list of the major economic players. And then you have Ukraine, where the conflict in Ukraine brought such international leadership and emphasis on the part of the West to that issue in the UN and elsewhere, and the resentment that there were a lot of challenges happening in the global South. There was a lot of disruption. There is a lot of military confrontations that are happening that get no attention, but Ukraine was pushed to the forefront of the international agenda with major sanctions that they were, being asked to support. And you saw more than 40 of these countries in the UN General Assembly not supporting the sanctions, mainly because they were resentful of the fact that this issue was getting the importance because it was something that was happening in Europe, and the attitudes towards refugees and migrants was much more open than they had been to the conflict and oppression and the dislocation that's happening in the global South.
We're talking with Dr. Lori Esposito Murray about the Global South. We're going to take a short break and be right back.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate ESG? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge, from economics, marketing and communications, ESG, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland from the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Dr. Lori Esposito Murray to talk about the Global South. Okay, so Lori, we got to go back to this. Right before the break, we were talking about this. 88% of the population is in the Global South, 40% of the GDP. Some of the stress points you were just talking about, COVID-19, vaccinations, and all of that. You talked about climate and how a lot of the issues around carbon, reside in the industrialized north and yet affect the globe. And so there's this, and then of course you've got China as an historic empire, and trying to assert what they view as their rightful place in the world. All of these things are kind of coming to bear now, and on top of that, you have a more globalized economy where the industrialized West have moved a large portion of their supply chain manufacturing and so forth to these areas of the world. And so it's not like you can just have a disconnected situation here. So these issues need to be addressed because it is an integrated one whole as a global economy. So talk about that, and because that's all new. I mean, relatively new in the context of history, right?
Well, Steve, what's really important is not only is it new, but the reaction in terms of what is happening with trade as a result of COVID-19 and America's concerns about the preeminence, America and the world's concerns about the preeminence of China in supply chains is now leading to an even more diversified trade arrangement where these countries are becoming even more important in terms of onshoring, nearshoring. And so, in fact, even though there has been a lot of discussion about deglobalization, the role of the global south in the economy actually is going to become even more important given the de emphasis in terms of the role that China plays in the economy and the importance to respond to that. And as I said, that was really triggered first by COVID-19, as well as concerns in the East-West challenges and concerns about China's growth and role in the world. But COVID-19 actually was the spark for the fact that the whole world was dependent on a supply chain coming out of one major nation and that we need to diversify. So the global south is only going to become more important in the economy.
Well, and then you've got labor shortages and skill set shortages in the developed West that can only be made up from the populations elsewhere. So it's not like it's a choice in some ways. You can't snap your fingers or throw a switch and fix it, or oh gee, let's get our supply chains out of China. Oh well, it took us 30 years to get them into China. So all of this works very slowly, but the issues are bubbling right now, and so you feel this urgency because of the tension.
Right. And as these issues, whether it's climate, become more and more important, the damage and loss agenda coming from the global south, also sharing in climate technology or debt, the amount of debt that the global south has accumulated, which keeps them from addressing the societal problems that they face, whether it's education or healthcare. And one of the interesting ironies of this, which shows you how difficult it is to talk about the global south, most $1 trillion of debt is owed to China from the global south because of the Belt and Road Initiative. And so China is one of the major $1 trillion of debt is owed to them. Now, China argues that debt helps countries grow, but when you have that much debt and you need debt restructure in order for these countries to advance, and you have China being the world's principal creditor right now, the globe's principal creditor, it's a very complicated issue in terms of how to move forward. But debt is one of the heavy debt burden is one of the major issues facing them.
Yeah, and then you have to start to question. China is, as you pointed out, the second largest economy in the world now. It's still certainly lower than the developed West in GDP per capita, but it has a huge amount of population. It has huge resources, clearly a huge geography, and then with this Belt and Road Initiative, it has extensive influence through its control of the debt, or the ownership of this $1 trillion in debt, but also their projects throughout the rest of the global south. I mean, it's at what point do you then say, well, gee, China is really not in the global south anymore, it's really in the global north, and it's you got to disaggregate it.
Yeah, but in terms of getting back to what identifies what are the principal identifications of the global south, in terms of disrupting the international order, in terms of diminishing the preeminence of the wealthy, industrialized Western alliance, China is first and foremost, first among equals in terms of that effort, as far as disrupting and reorganizing and the international order and diminishing the role of the North. So on geopolitical, philosophical terms, they are right in there with the global South as far as a global agenda.
Yeah, so that's an attitudinal thing, and so therefore you have to come back to this geopolitical discussion, because most of what we've been talking about is economic, but it's geopolitical, and so there's this notion now that's been used recently called the BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and what, I guess it's South Africa, but there's also Saudi Arabia that may be thrown in. So this is another, it's I guess a subset of the global South that is coming together more as a geopolitical alliance.
Yeah, and what the BRICS and the global South are pretty much in sync, except the BRICS are a much smaller, as you said, it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and they just expanded to Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE. And so they're smaller. It's very much in sync, though, with the Global South agenda. And most of the wannabe leaders of the Global South are part of the BRICS. You've got Russia, China, India, and South Africa, all really positioning themselves, and Brazil, of course, under Lula, positioning themselves as leaders of the Global South and this movement to disrupt the international order that has and the predominance of the North.
So where does this go? I mean, so it's a subset of the BRICS, is a subset, sort of. I mean, not officially, but it is a subset of the global South. Does it then become the geopolitical thought leader? And then what about the military alliances in this?
Well, the BRICS is really trying to establish itself as a counterpoint to the G7. So yes, as leaders in terms of policy and direction, emphasizing diminishing U.S. dominance in the global financial system, diminishing SWIFT, the payment system, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications, SWIFT, the payment system, where most international payments have gone through, and diminishing that and actually using local currencies, establishing financial institutions. The BRICS really are positioning themselves as the G7 is positioned as leaders, thought leaders, policy leaders for this agenda. And so you're really seeing that shift. But you mentioned the military, and here's where it's really interesting to see what's been happening militarily as well. And China and Russia have together been have really accelerated their joint military operations since 2016. They've done more than 40 since 2016. They've been doing them since 2003. Since 2016, they've done half of the overall count of their military operations together. The reason why this is significant is because the joint exercises also include Pakistan, Iran, as well as in terms of how they're actually coordinating. So this is new in terms of the military organization and coordination among countries other than the West. And it's also where they're taking place. They're taking place on the South African coast, the Mediterranean Sea, the Baltic Sea, out in the Western Pacific, and really signaling that although, in these initial stages, although involving fewer countries than the BRICS themselves or the entire, obviously global South, there is a military coordination and joint operations that are taking place that one will have military significance, but two are signaling that there is a counter force to the dominance of the Western alliance.
Well, it will be interesting, and you may not agree with this, but you can kind of see projecting down the road where this small group of countries, the BRICS, primarily Russia, and primarily Russia, China, and India, and and I guess primarily Russia and China, end up being the mouthpiece of the global south and essentially acting more like what they accuse the global north of doing, and hence creating a tension there. You can almost see the balance of the global south kind of coming over to the global north, maybe from an alliance standpoint, to get out from underneath this other halo. I mean, these are the kinds of things that and over time, who knows? I mean, I don't know if that's going to happen or not going to happen. But it is interesting how these countries, people don't like to be told what to do by these other sovereign nations.
Yeah, and you can't diminish the conflict actually within the global South itself. And as I said, this struggle to who is actually going to lead the global South, and that just brings me to the point of China and India. India really wants to play, has traditionally played. They were the leaders of the non-aligned movement, and Modi has made it really clear, both in the meetings that he's hosted, when he's opened them, saying that he is representing the global South, and it's important for the global South to have an agenda at this very important transformational time in geopolitics, to have an agenda to actually define how that change in the international order happens. So you have India positioning itself, you have Brazil positioning itself in Latin America, South America, but globally as representative, as leadership of the global South, as well as South Africa, and then, of course, China, and as I said, Russia is playing a very big role as far as the agenda of changing the international order.
Yeah, and but China's not going to allow India to do that. And oh, by the way, there's this longstanding conflict on their northern, the India's northern border with China, and over Kashmir and other issues. So it's not like they've been best of friends for a long time. So as you're looking at this at 30,000 feet, it's not. It looks better from the air than it does, I guess, at the ground level.
Exactly, exactly, and you could even go deeper with Saudi Arabia and Iran and Ethiopia and Egypt. I mean, so, but there are still commonalities that have brought them together traditionally since the beginning of the Cold War. As I said, with the non-aligned movement and the G77, that this positioning where you're not actually supporting one power or the other, except in this case, the other is China, and China's part of the global South. So it's a different era, but what brings them together is a disruption of the international order, so that the issues that affect countries that are dealing with social challenges, climate challenges, social challenges, disruption, the inability to address their social issues and develop economies. It's going back to the old debates about, how do developing countries advance, and can they advance with the oppression of the northern wealthy dominance of the economy? And so it's all those issues coming to the fore. And as I said, I think they were accelerated by COVID-19, by Ukraine, and they're manifesting themselves. We're watching it happening in Gaza with South Africa and Nicaragua, both South Africa bringing Israel to the International Court of Justice with genocide claims, and Nicaragua bringing Germany to the International Court of Justice with genocide claims that they're supplying weapons to Israel. So you're seeing it manifested there as a counter to what's happening in the advanced industrial societies.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, but more to come. Dr. Lori Esposito Murray, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thank you, Steve. I really appreciate the invitation.
You have been listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.